In this video, I'm going to explain about the access control types. There are several types of access controls. For example, a policy that provides information on who is authorized to access a resource and an access list implemented on a firewall to limit access to a resource are two types of access controls. In this case, the policy would be an administrative access control, whereas the access list would be a technical or logical access control. Controls can be classified into three main categories: administrative control, physical controls, and technical controls. Let me to explain first about the administrative controls, sometimes called management controls. These include the policies, procedures around the definition of access controls, definition of information classifications, roles and responsibilities, and in general, anything that is needed to manage access control from the administrative point of view. Administrative controls are usually directly overseen by senior management. Administrative controls include the following subcategories. First, operational and security policies and procedures. This could include policies about change control, vulnerability management, information classification, product lifecycle management, and so on. Second, policies around personnel or employee security. This could include the level of clearance needed to access specific information, background checks on new hires, and so on. Generally, this category includes policies on all the controls that need to be in place before access is granted to a resource. Third, security education and training. This subcategory includes all the policies and efforts needed to implement end-user training and education. And fourth, auditing and monitoring policies. This might include policy on how to perform employee monitoring, system and compliance auditing, and so on. The next type of access controls is physical control. This type of control is aimed at protecting the physical boundaries and ensuring employee safety. This type of controls are usually deployed in various layers in accordance with the concept of defense in depth. Examples of these controls are the fence at the entrance of the building, fire alarms, surveillance systems, and security guards. Physical access controls are usually designed by defining security zones, for example data center, and implementing physical controls depending on the classification of the assets. For example, entering the data center area may require additional privilege versus entering the building facilities. And finally, the next type of access control is technical controls. These controls, also called logical controls, are all the logical and technological system in place to implement and enforce the controls included in the security policy and in general dictated by the administrative controls. A firewall, an intrusion detection system, a remote access server, an identity management system, and encryption are all examples of the technical controls. Beside the administrative, physical, and technical classification, access controls can also be classified based on their purpose. Access controls can be categorized as having preventive, detective, corrective, deterrent, recovery, and compensating capacities as detailed in the following list. Both classification approach can work at the same time. For example, about the encrypting data when it is at rest is a technical control aimed at preventing unauthorized access to the data itself. Let me to explain first about the preventive controls. Preventive controls enforce security policy and should prevent incidents from happening. The only way to bypass a preventive control is to find a flaw in its implementation or logic. These controls are usually not optional. Examples of preventive controls are access lists, passwords, and fences. About the deterrent controls. Deterrent controls are similar to preventive controls in the sense that the primary objective is to prevent an incident from occurring. Unlike preventive controls, however, the rationale behind deterrent control is to discourage an attacker from proceeding just because a control is in place. For example, a system banner warning that any unauthorized attempt to log in will be monitored and punished is a type of deterrent control. In fact, it would probably discourage a casual user from attempting to access the system. However, it might not block a determined attacker from trying to log into the system. About to the detective controls. Actually, detective control aim at monitoring and detecting any unauthorized behavior or hazard. These type of controls are generally used to alert a failure in other types of controls such as preventive, deterrent, and compensating controls. Detective controls are very powerful while an attack is taking place, and they are useful in the post-mortem analysis to understand what has happened. Audit logs, intrusion detection systems, motion detection, and security information and event management are examples of detective controls. About the corrective controls, actually corrective controls include all the controls used during an incident to correct the problem. Quarantining an infected computer, sending a guard to block an intruder, and terminating an employee from not having followed the security policy are all examples of corrective controls. Recovery controls are used after the environment or system has been modified because of an unauthorized access or due to other reasons. They are aimed at restoring the initial behavior, performing a backup, implementing a redundant system, and creating a disaster recovery plan are all examples of recovery controls. Compensating controls complement or offer an alternative to the primary control. These type of controls are generally used as temporary measures until the primary control is implemented, or to increase the efficacy of the primary control. Overall, the goal of compensating control is to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. For example, a security guard checking your badge because the badge reader is temporarily out of order would be an example of a compensating control. It is sometimes hard to properly classify a control. For example, an access list could be classified as preventive. However, it might also be a deterrent because if you know that your access is blocked, you would probably not attempt to access a resource. An access list would also be used as a detective control if it is implemented in a way that permits traffic and logs when someone has actually access to a, for example, resource. Generally, it is important to get information about the context in which the control is used, but you should also think of the main purpose of the control itself. For example, an access list should probably be classified as preventive rather than as a deterrent. This figure shows how each type of control maps to the Cisco attack continuum. Preventive and deterrent controls can be used before an attack occurs to harden and avoid an attack. Detective and corrective controls are used during an attack to detect the attack and mitigate its impact. Recovery controls are used after the attack to return to a normal situation. Compensating controls span the attack continuum and can be used before, during, and after an attack.